I want to talk this morning about what was going on in the world and in our denomination around 2017. Because something was telling us it was time to change our ways of being in the world. And that something was graphic acts of state-sanctioned violence posted on social media. The convenience of cell phone video cameras made it impossible to pretend we lived in a post-racial world simply because we had had an African-American president. When a moral, social, economic, and political system privileges one group over another, it perpetuates a culture of oppression. When these biases become the accepted norm, they are codified as a good fit, or best practice, or policy, and even law, to create structures of oppression that operate within any given system or institution. Once oppression is institutionalized, it is less apparent than the violent acts of individual extremists, and far more effective because of it. In fact, it is the very lack of awareness that perpetuates oppression. Through the gift of awareness, however painful it may be, we come to accept a reality other than our own, engage in a process of reconciliation, or the renewal of our commitment to live more consciously and act more justly. To acknowledge we are the beneficiary of the dominant culture and therefore complicit in maintaining the status quo, it is painfully difficult. And this is the gift of awareness brought to us by the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement coalesced in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin in 2013, and was founded by 3 radical Black female organizers. Unlike the focus of the American Civil Rights Movement on legislation to end racial discrimination, the focus of the Black Lives Matter movement is to dismantle the interlocking structures of racism, sexism, heteronormativity, and economic oppression by centering the margins. When we center the margins, we appoint qualified people with marginalized identities to leadership positions to address the needs of people who have been relegated to the margins of society by white culture. Just like Wacky Quacky, who could not see over the fence in our illustration this morning. As social media raised white awareness about racial violence in America, outrage spilled out into the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. Racial tension ran high across the nation, and many of us participated in peaceful protests and attended rallies in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. At the 2015 General Assembly, Unitarian Universalists designated the Black Lives Matter movement as an action for immediate witness. And in 2016, the UUA's Board of Trustees approved a $5.3 million fund to a partner organization called Black Lives Unitarian Universalists, often referred to by its acronym BLUE. Now, this is a significant event in the history of our denomination because during the civil rights movement, the UUA defaulted on a $1 million grant to fund an organization of Black Unitarian Universalists. The default was due in part to a lack of funds and a condition of oversight on how the money was spent. Growing tension within the denomination resulted in a brawl on the UUA General Assembly floor in 1969, and was followed by a mass exodus of people of color from the Assembly and from our denomination. The 2015 allocation of $5.3 million is an attempt to right a wrong in our denomination's history. Congregations participated in a wildly successful fundraising event to match the UUA's contributions. And the initiative was called The Promise and the Practice. Does anyone here, does that sound familiar to anyone here? The Promise and the Practice? Okay. Then in March of 2017, and this is where I wish we had a fireplace right here and we were all sitting in comfy chairs. Because in March of 2017, Trump was in office. The Me Too movement was not quite at its height yet, but was getting there. There was a major disruption at the UUA that occurred when a white male minister was chosen for a regional lead position instead of an equally qualified Hispanic female religious educator who served on the UUA Board of Trustees. The explanation given was the male candidate was a better fit for the institution. The clergy Facebook page exploded with vitriol over the decision, and charges were leveled against the UUA for upholding a culture of white supremacy. In response, our then UUA president, Peter Morales, and I want to emphasize our male UUA president, called for more humility and thoughtfulness, and less self-righteousness and hysteria from staff and clergy. Well, if there's one thing you don't tell a woman is that she's being hysterical. Right? And this only served to make matters worse because it occurred during the Me Too movement, a global Me Too movement. Ultimately, the male candidate withdrew his acceptance of the regional lead position, and within 30 days, our UUA president, our chief operating officer, the director of congregational life, the president of the Ministers Association, and the moderator all resigned. 4 of the top 5 executives were white males, and only the moderator resigned for health reasons and was admitted to hospice and within a week had passed away. The Board of Trustees apologized to its constituents for the inadequate response of leadership to a hiring practice that systematically centers and advantages white people at the UUA and vowed to redress the situation. The trustees then formed a special council and adopted the leadership philosophy of the Black Lives Matter movement. It centered the margins with the appointment of 3 interim co-presidents, 1 woman, 2 men, all persons of color. Blue organized a white supremacy teach-in for over 680 UU congregations and had this to say: white supremacy is a provocative phrase as it conjures up images of hoods and mobs. Yet in 2017, actual white supremacists are not required in order to uphold white supremacist culture. Building a faith full of people who understand that key distinction is essential as we work toward a more just society in these difficult times. Our interim co-presidents then established a committee on institutional and cultural change. They were charged to conduct an audit of the UUA's hiring practices, establish a truth and reconciliation process, develop new hiring and personnel practices, conduct a power analysis of the UUA, and report back to the trustees at General Assembly in 2020. The report, called Widening the Circle of Concern, revealed hiring practices, forms of governance, worship, and education that reflect white culture. For example, the Commission conducted a survey of other professional organizations in the greater Boston area to discover 30 to 40% of their employees identified as people of color, compared to only 10% of staff at the UUA. New hiring practices were adopted, and by 2020, 42% of the UUA's Leadership Council identified as people of color. Some of these other observations in the report might surprise you. The Commission found white culture included the patriarchal use of that dang Robert's Rules of Order, which no one can ever remember, right? Okay, are we supposed to do this first or that? So, Robert's Rules of Order is a parliamentary procedure. It dates back to ancient Greece and 16th century England. White culture. The UUA has since adopted the feminist model of circle leadership by consensus. Also not perfect, but better, and provides training to congregations who wish to do the same. So I say to you, parish committee members, you don't have to hang on to Robert's Rules of Order. You can let it go. Just let it go. Where was I? Wish to do the same. Oh, yeah. This one may not surprise you, I don't know. Our Unitarian forebears placed a high value on formal education, with ministers who graduated Harvard, wore academic robes in the pulpit, delivered long sermons that resembled lectures. Of course, none of that ever happened here, right? No, I didn't think so. The denomination is now moving away from those lengthy cerebral sermons and moving toward shorter inspirational messages to produce more embodied and experiential services, all of which draws on our universalist heritage. And that is what we're going to be experimenting with here this year. Another thing about our worship services, which isn't a problem here, is the concert-style performance of classical music during worship. We now embrace popular, folk, and ethnic music that inspires movement. You know, none of this statuesque sitting, not even tapping, but just listening, which is also a cerebral experience. I do enjoy classical music. It just does something from my brain, but it does nothing from my... Now, music with percussion, music with energy and excitement, that leads to an embodied experience of worship. The UUA, if you watch General Assembly, you may have noticed that the UUA has begun modeling some of these changes by inviting people with minority identities to lead worship and musicians to provide a variety of multicultural music, and the less formal presentation of information through the interview process with a keynote speaker. Other institutional changes at the UUA include anti-oppression training for all new and existing employees, the use of professional expenses for denominational leaders to hire anti-racism coaches, and the formation and weekly meetings of identity support groups during business hours. Additionally, all UUA ministers are now required to participate in continuing education related to anti-racism and anti-oppression. Ministry, I believe the report said that ministry was the only profession that required a graduate degree and did not require continuing education credits. And so we've shifted from what was once viewed as a learned profession, and I want you to read between the lines, means expert in, to being a learning profession. That it's impossible to ever learn all there is to learn. And that we openly admit that if we're not aware of something, we want to be aware of it. We want to learn. We want to better our community and ourselves. I witnessed this model of leadership based on learning rather than expertise at the Finding Our Way Home retreat for UU professionals of color earlier this year. When UUA President Sophia Betancourt gave her address, she greeted the assembly and promptly decentered herself as the expert in the room by calling upon others who were more knowledgeable to answer questions from the floor. This model of shared leadership was a radical departure from the poise of the traditional presidential addresses. The UU Ministers Association also revised its code of professional conduct to specifically identify oppressive behavior and establish a system of accountability that includes a process of reconciliation and repair. Refusal to engage in the process may result in removal from fellowship and potentially lead to the loss of employment. The presentation of a virtual General Assembly during the pandemic dramatically reduced the cost of attendance and dramatically increased the number of attendees. Higher attendance meant a broader demographic of voters were now able to participate in making the decisions of the association. This option has been so well received. The UUA has decided to offer an all-virtual General Assembly every other year. And last but not least, the Commission recommended a revision of the UUA bylaws, in particular Article 2, which states our commitment to, which states our principles and our sources. And the Commission appointed a committee to do some research, to think outside the box of our 7 principles, and come up with something that explicitly states our commitment to anti-oppression. It's easy to say, well, it's implied in this principle or in that principle, right? Which is very much like saying, when we use the term man, we're referring to all people. So we'll learn later this month at another service just what this commission was able to produce for our consideration and what has been passed at this past year's General Assembly. According to Gordon Drack, an expert with over 40 years of experience in transforming declining towns, suburban, and city churches into thriving, multicultural, and multiracial congregations, it takes 3 to 4 years to root a new culture in any organization. And by the 10th year, the new culture takes hold and begins to thrive. We are currently in our 6th year. Professor of International Politics Mark Benson tells us, Peacemaking does not mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. It is the act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. It is the act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressor free. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom." May it be so.